The flickering neon sign of the Lucky Star Diner cast long, sickly green shadows across the rain-slicked pavement. Officer Ben Carter, a man whose youth had been worn down by 4 years on the night shift in the notoriously forgotten district of Havenwood, nursed a lukewarm coffee inside his cruiser. His partner, Officer Lisa Moreno, a sharp, cynical woman who'd seen too much too fast, scrolled through mundane police reports on her tablet. "Another quiet Tuesday, Carter," Moreno sighed, her voice a dry rasp. "Just the usual, stray dogs, a couple arguing over who gets the last slice of pizza, and old Mr. Henderson complaining about ghosts in his attic again. Quiet is good, Moreno." "Quiet means less paperwork," Ben replied, taking a gulp of the bitter coffee. He was checking the clock, 3:17 a.m. The time when the world felt less real, more like a poorly lit stage. Suddenly the cruiser's radio crackled to life, slicing through the sleepy silence. The dispatcher's voice, usually calm and monotone, was edged with a tremor. "Units 405 and 407, Code 3, respond to 1423 Willow Creek Road. Repeat, 1423 Willow Creek Road. Caller reports, unusual activity. Repeat, unusual activity. Priority 1. Willow Creek Road wasn't in their immediate patrol zone. It was deep in the Whispering Pines development, a place of sprawling, secluded mansions, mostly owned by absentee executives. It was the kind of address where you usually found rich kids throwing a loud party, not a Code 3. Unusual activity? What the hell does that mean, dispatch?" Moreno asked, her hand already gripping the gearshift. Caller was barely coherent for 105. Said something about lights and shadows. And then the line went dead. Sounded genuinely terrified. "Use caution, officers." Ben and Lisa exchanged a look that was part annoyance and part professional curiosity. They flipped on the siren and lights. The cruiser lunged forward, eating up the desolate asphalt that as they neared Willow Creek, the dense, old-growth pines of Havenwood closed in, swallowing the city lights. The air grew colder, heavier. The GPS led them down a long, winding gravel driveway that ended abruptly in front of a house that seemed impossibly dark. It was a massive Gothic revival structure, more a castle than a home, shrouded in climbing ivy and silence. No lights were on. No sound. "Looks like everyone is asleep or gone," Moreno muttered, already unbuckling. Maybe the caller was drunk. "Wait," Ben said, holding up a hand. He pointed to the front door. "Look at the lock." The expensive, reinforced deadbolt on the heavy oak door wasn't just picked or forced. It was shattered. Pieces of the metal casing were embedded in the wood, as if struck by something with impossible force. "Something big happened here," Lisa whispered, drawing her sidearm. "Stay behind me, Carter. You take the first floor, I'll clear the stairs." They pushed the door open. The interior was a cavern of stale air and velvet darkness. The rich scent of old wood and dust was overlaid with something metallic and pungent. Ben flicked on his tactical flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom, revealing a grand foyer. A towering grandfather clock stood against one wall, its pendulum frozen at the 3:17 a.m. mark. Then they saw the first sign that this was not a normal break-in. Across the pristine white marble floor, starting from the shattered entryway and leading toward the back of the house, was a faint, sticky trail. It wasn't blood, not exactly. It was too thick, too dark, and segmented like a series of tiny perfect impressions pressed into the dust. "What is that?" Ben asked, his voice low and tight. Moreno shook her head, her beam following the trail. "Looks like residue. Like something heavy and wet was dragged across the floor. Stay alert." They followed the disturbing path into a large, formal dining room. Everything looked normal. A mahogany table, high-backed chairs, expensive china cabinet. But the trail ended abruptly at the wall beside the fireplace. There was a section of wallpaper that looked slightly darker, slightly newer than the rest. Ben pressed against it. It gave way with a low, grating sound, revealing a narrow, hidden doorway leading down. "A basement," Moreno breathed. Of course there's a basement. You ready, Carter? Ben swallowed, the lukewarm coffee churning in his stomach. He raised his flashlight and the tension in the house seemed to squeeze the air out of the room. Lead the way, Moreno. The air in the concealed stairwell was immediately colder, the metallic smell overwhelmingly strong. As they descended, their flashlight beams dancing wildly, they noticed that the segmented, sticky trail continued down the rough concrete steps, seemingly oozing its way into the depths. When they reached the bottom, the basement was vast and unfinished, a concrete labyrinth supported by thick ancient wooden beams. And in the center of the room, under a single bare hanging light bulb that cast a dull yellow glow, stood a sight that made both seasoned officers freeze at a large, crudely assembled altar stood on the damp concrete. It was constructed from stacked cinder blocks and draped with a black, heavy cloth. Upon the altar was a disturbing collection of items, a rusted surgical tray, several tarnished brass bells, and a series of hand-drawn diagrams that Ben didn't want to look at too closely. But it was what was in front of the altar that stopped their hearts. Lying on the floor, perfectly centered, was the collar. A woman in an expensive silk dressing gown, her eyes wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling. She was untouched, no visible wounds, save for one detail that in her mouth, forced deep into her throat, was a single intricately carved piece of bone. It looked polished, almost wet, and then a sound. A slow, wet slish-slish coming from the shadows between the support beams, like a heavy reptile dragging itself across the stone. Moreno spun, her gun raised. Police, show yourself. The sound stopped. The bare bulb above them flickered, plunging the basement into momentary blackness, then back to its sickly yellow light. When the light returned, the body of the woman was still there, but the carved bone was gone, and the sticky, segmented trail on the floor leading into the shadows was now a fresh, glistening path, slowly expanding. The silence that followed the disappearing bone was heavy, toxic. It pressed down on Ben, muffling his breath. His flashlight beam was glued to the spot where the bizarre object had rested moments before. Did you see that? Ben gasped, his voice a strained whisper, adrenaline spiking through his exhaustion. Moreno didn't answer right away. Her face was pale, tight with an effort to maintain composure. She kept her weapon fixed on the darkest recess of the support beams, her eyes darting frantically. It didn't disappear, Carter. Something took it, she finally ground out, her finger trembling slightly on the trigger. And whatever it is, it's still down here. The metallic stench, the pungent smell they had noticed upstairs, was overpowering now. It was coppery like blood but mixed with something else. A musky, reptilian odor, foreign and deeply unsettling. Moreno took a single slow step toward the shadows, her tactical training overriding her instinct to flee. This is a crime scene. We secure the area. Call for backup now. Ben fumbled with the radio on his shoulder. His hand was slick with cold sweat. 405 to dispatch. We need immediate backup and an ambulance at 1423 Willow Creek Road. Repeat, backup and ambulance. Possible homicide. Suspect is unknown. Proceed with caution. He didn't mention the disappearing bone or the strange trail. He knew how it would sound over the air. Just as he finished the transmission, a low, guttural noise echoed from the darkness. It wasn't a growl, nor was it a human cough. It sounded like something large, heavy, and wet scraping its way over rough concrete. Slish, 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 it's moving, Moreno hissed, dropping into a defensive crouch. Stay on my 6, Carter. They slowly advanced, the yellow light bulb above them flickering like a dying star. The sticky, segmented trail led directly between two thick wooden pillars. As they approached, the air seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Ben could feel the hairs standing up on the back of his neck. There! Moreno shouted, pointing her light at first. Ben saw nothing but shadow and concrete. Then the light caught it. It was a section of the floor, maybe 10 feet ahead, where the cement looked freshly churned, almost liquefied. And resting in the center of the softened patch was a single immense print that was impossibly long and narrow, like a bare human foot, but scaled up to nearly 3 times the size. The heel was elongated, and the toes were fused together, ending in thick, curved talons. The entire print was coated in the dark, glistening residue. "Dear God, what is that?" Ben whispered, the gun in his hand feeling suddenly small and useless. Before Moreno could respond, the wooden beam directly above the grotesque footprint cracked with the sound of a pistol shot. Splinters rained down. They both looked up. High in the shadows where the pillar met the ceiling, they saw the source of the noise point. 2 pinpoints of light, pale and reflecting the yellow bulb, were focused directly on them. They were too close together, too large to be an animal, but too low to be a person standing upright. Then the creature moved. It shifted, and for a terrifying split second, the flashlight caught a glimpse of its form. It was long, impossibly thin and sinuous, clinging to the beam like a shadow. Its skin, or scales, was a mottled, pale gray, nearly indistinguishable from the concrete. Its limbs seemed to be folded tightly against its body. Before Ben could even process what he was seeing, the creature dropped. Not with a crash, but with unnerving speed and silence, landing precisely where the enormous footprint was. The resulting sound wasn't the impact of a body, it was a loud, sharp hiss, like air escaping a ruptured hose, immediately followed by the sickening splash of the residue hitting the concrete. Moreno fired 3 quick, practiced shots aimed squarely at the center mass. The bullet struck, but the effect was horrifyingly anticlimactic. The rounds didn't penetrate or slow the creature. They merely impacted its slick, dense surface, making dull thwack sounds, and seemed to stick to the residue coating its body before falling harmlessly to the ground. The creature barely flinched. It lifted its head. Its neck was long, thin, and impossibly flexible. In the brief, terrified moment that Ben and Lisa had to look, they saw the full extent of its face. It was reptilian, with a wide, lipless mouth filled with rows of needle-sharp teeth. But the eyes, those terrifying, pale pinpoints, were unmistakably intelligent. They held a cold, predatory cunning. It opened its mouth. The hiss became a low, vibrating rumble that shook the concrete floor. The smell intensified, burning their nostrils. "Run, Carter. Now!" Moreno screamed, shoving Ben backward toward the stairs and firing her remaining rounds in a desperate, covering burst. Ben didn't hesitate. He scrambled up the slick, segmented trail of the stairs. As he looked back, he saw Moreno taking aim again, pulling the trigger only to hear the loud click of an empty chamber. The creature was moving toward her, no longer slithering but lurching forward on those massive, elongated feet, covering the distance with unnerving speed. Ben reached the foyer, pulling the hidden door shut with a frantic heave. He fumbled for the latch, jamming the locking mechanism just as a tremendous, bone-jarring impact slammed against the wood. Silence. Then a faint, muffled, but utterly terrifying sound from behind the concealed door. Moreno's scream, cut brutally short. Ben stood frozen, his flashlight beam shaking wildly, trained on the hidden door. The wood was buckling. The sickeningly sweet, metallic smell was already beginning to seep through the crack. He had to move. He was alone. And whatever was down there was powerful enough to shatter deadbolts, resist bullets, and silence a trained officer in seconds. He bolted for the main entryway, his training replaced by raw, primal panic. He burst out the front door and into the cool, driving rain, tripping over the threshold. He scrambled back to the cruiser, radioing dispatch, his voice hoarse and broken. "Dispatch. Officer down. 1423 Willow Creek Road. Suspect is not human. I repeat, not human. Officer Moreno is down. Send all units. Code 99. He slammed the doors shut, threw the car into reverse, and sped away from the house, leaving the massive, dark silhouette of the estate behind him, knowing that he had just abandoned his partner to a nightmare he couldn't even begin to describe. The single, most chilling thought that echoed in his mind was the feeling of the heavy, segmented residue seeping into the concrete floor, a tangible sign of something ancient and horrifying, now awake and loose in Havenwood. Ben Carter was driving blind, the rain-streaked windshield a blur of flashing blue and red light reflected from the cruiser's siren. He didn't slow until he hit the main road, the asphalt vibrating under the tires as he drove far faster than departmental protocol allowed. His hands were locked locked on the steering wheel, knuckles white. The cold panic was curdling into a white-hot, desperate resolve that he finally pulled over 3 miles from the estate, slamming the gearshift into park. He was shaking violently, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. He grabbed the microphone, his voice still ragged. "Dispatch, confirm units en route to 1423 Willow Creek Road. Give me an ET." The dispatcher's voice, now high-pitched with alarm, crackled back. 405, we have multiple units diverting now, approximately 8 minutes out. Chief Harrison is on his way. Officer Carter, are you secure? We lost contact with 407. Can you confirm the status of Officer Moreno? Ben squeezed his eyes shut, trying to purge the image of the creature's eyes and the abrupt end of Moreno's scream. Confirmed, dispatch. Officer Moreno is deceased. I saw the suspect. It's unlike anything you've seen. It's large, fast, and rounds did not stop it. I'm waiting at the junction of Highway 12 and Willow Creek. I will brief the incoming units. He hung up the mic, leaning his head back against the seat. He was a cop, trained for violence, for confrontations, for the darkest aspects of humanity. He was trained for men. But what he had faced in that basement was something primal, something that belonged not in a police file, but in a forgotten mythology. 8 minutes later, the junction was awash in the light of half a dozen squad cars. Chief Marcus Harrison, a weary man with 3 decades on the force and a face carved by cynicism, stepped out of his black SUV. He took one look at Ben, the sweat-soaked uniform, the wide, unfocused stare, and knew this wasn't a standard breakdown. Harrison walked up to the cruiser, his expression grim. "Carter, you sound like you've seen a ghost. What the hell happened to Moreno?" Ben forced himself to meet the chief's gaze. He knew how this sounded. He knew the department would brand him crazy or worse, responsible. But he had to tell the truth. "Chief, listen to me. It wasn't a person. We found a concealed basement. There was some kind of ritual altar set up. The victim, the caller, was dead. And then it appeared." He pointed to the floor of his own cruiser, where a faint, dark smudge of the sticky, segmented residue was still clinging to his boot heel. It left a trail of this stuff. It was enormous. It was reptilian, but it moved like a human. Moreno emptied her weapon into it. "Chief." The bullet stuck to its skin. It just took her. Harrison's face hardened, his voice dropping to a dangerous level. "A reptile, Carter? You're telling me a giant lizard killed your partner?" "I know how it sounds," Ben pleaded, "but it's the truth." The doors were busted out, not forced. The victim had a piece of carved bone in her throat. This thing is connected to whatever bizarre ritual was going on down there. Harrison held up a hand, silencing him. He looked over at the assembled officers, their faces serious but also skeptical. He had a duty to his men and a duty to the city. "All right, Carter. You're rattled. That's understandable. But we proceed by the book. We have an officer down. Lieutenant Pierce, organize a search team. 2 groups. One secures the perimeter. The second, 4 officers, shields, non-lethal and lethal deployment ready, breach the house. We treat this as an armed, extremely dangerous suspect. Carter, you stay here. You're temporarily off duty, pending statement." Ben felt a surge of cold fury. "Chief, if you send them in without knowing what they're facing, they'll be killed. It's bulletproof, sir. You need SWAT, and you need to evacuate the entire area." "I need facts, Carter, not fairy tales," Harrison snapped. "I need my partner back," he added under his breath, referring to Moreno. Lieutenant Pierce, a solid, no-nonsense officer, nodded once, gathering the search team. They moved quickly, efficiently, and silently back toward 1423 Willow Creek Road. Ben watched them go, his stomach twisting into knots. He knew what they would find: the shattered door, the hidden stairwell, the crude altar, and the trail that he couldn't stay. He couldn't leave his partner's memory, and the lives of his fellow officers, to the chief's stubborn disbelief that he pulled a small, backup flashlight from his vest and slipped his personal knife into his pocket. As the other officers watched the search team's retreating taillights, Ben quietly slipped out the passenger door of his cruiser, moving into the deep, rain-soaked shadows of the whispering pines that he knew he couldn't fight the thing. Not with a standard issue 9mm. But he had to confirm the monster was still contained. He had to prove he wasn't crazy, that he moved silently through the dense foliage paralleling the driveway. When he got close to the house, he dropped into a low crouch, creeping up to the side of the building. The search team's flashlights were already visible through the lower windows, casting nervous, jerky beams. Ben heard the muffled sounds of officers shouting commands, "Clear." Moving to the next room, as they swept the main floor, he reached the window that he calculated led to the dining room, the room with the hidden entrance. He raised himself slowly and peered in. The room was lit by the team's powerful tactical lights. 4 officers were spread out, weapons ready. One of them, Officer Davies, was crouched by the fireplace, examining the section of the wall where the hidden door was. Davies put his hand on the disguised entrance. "LT, I think we got something here. This wall looks hollow." As Davies started to apply pressure to the wall, Ben saw that it wasn't inside the house. High above the officers' flashlights, silhouetted against the dark sky, something was moving on the roof. It was huge, segmented, and clinging effortlessly to the steep slate shingles. It had moved with unnatural speed, unnoticed by the team below. It was the creature. It had escaped the basement through an upper access or vent and was now positioned directly above its prey. It looked down at the dining room window where Davies was touching the hidden door. And then the creature lunged. It didn't jump or fall, it simply extended one of its impossibly long, pale gray limbs, snapping the glass of the dining room window with a sharp crack and hooking the officer closest to the window. Not Davies but Officer Miller, by the throat. Miller's scream was instantly strangled. The gigantic, scaled hand retracted, dragging Miller's struggling body through the jagged hole in the window glass, up and onto the roof with terrifying ease. The other officers, Davies, Lieutenant Pierce and Officer Kim, could only spin, their lights blindingly focused on the hole where their partner had been seconds ago. Ben didn't hesitate. The creature was out. It wasn't contained. And it had just claimed its second victim. He backed away, knowing that his small-time police department was no match for this horror. He had to get back to Chief Harrison, not with a plea, but with undeniable proof of what they were facing. He turned to run back toward the junction, but stopped dead. A sound. It was the same wet, dragging slish 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 sound he had heard in the basement, but it was much closer now. It was coming from the shadows of the very trees he was hiding in. The creature wasn't on the roof anymore. It was everywhere. Ben's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, desperate drumbeat in the oppressive silence of the woods. The sound, the wet, segmented drag, was close enough now that he could taste the metallic, musky stench that clung to the creature. He flattened himself against the wet trunk of an enormous pine, his breath shallow, trying to merge with the shadow. He gripped his small backup flashlight, deciding against using it. Light would betray him. The slish 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 sound was circling. It moved with a disturbing rhythm, too fast for something so large, too quiet for something that weighed so much. It was hunting, and Ben was trapped in the darkness with it. He risked a slow peek around the tree. He saw a shape, a movement, in the deepest shade near the perimeter wall of the estate. It wasn't slithering low. It was moving with an unnerving sideways scuttle, utilizing its long jointed limbs like a monstrous crab. He saw the segmented trail of dark, glistening residue it left behind on the forest floor, catching the faint reflection of the distant police lights. It's patrolling the exterior, Ben realized, a fresh wave of terror washing over him. It knows the other officers are inside, and it's keeping the escape route sealed. Inside the house, he could still hear the distant, panicked shouts of Lieutenant Pierce and the remaining officers. They were pinned down, trapped in the dining room, perhaps trying to drag Officer Miller's body back in, or just struggling to understand the impossible attack. Ben knew he couldn't get back to the cruiser now. He would be moving directly into the creature's path. His only chance was to slip away through the dense, overgrown woods, moving away from the driveway and the main road, and then circle back. He started his slow, agonizing retreat, moving with the meticulous silence he'd learned during brief, mandatory SWAT training years ago. He took 3 steps, placing each foot carefully on a patch of soft pine needles. Cracked. A small, dead twig snapped beneath his left heel. The slish-slish immediately stopped. The silence that followed was instant, absolute, and deadly. Ben froze, every muscle in his body locked. He could hear the blood rushing in his ears. He watched the shadows. They seemed to deepen, to coalesce. Then, from directly behind a large granite boulder 15 feet away, a sound like gravel shifting under immense weight. The creature didn't reveal its full form. Instead, one of its massive, scaled forelimbs, thick as a man's torso, ending in that sickening three-to-lone claw, shot out from behind the rock. It didn't strike at him. Instead, it moved to the ground directly in front of him, and with a horrifying liquid speed, it smeared a thick, fresh line of the dark, sticky residue onto the forest floor, cutting off his path that it was marking its territory. It was telling him, "I know where you are, and you are not going that way." Ben was forced to move deeper into the woods towards the unknown. He veered left, away from the path the creature had marked, sprinting through the undergrowth, ignoring the stinging slaps of the wet branches against his face that he ran for what felt like an hour but couldn't have been more than 2 minutes. The trees finally broke, revealing a small, forgotten clearing. In the center stood an even older, more decrepit structure. A tiny, moss-covered pump house, likely abandoned decades ago, its wooden door half rotted off its hinges. Ben didn't hesitate. He burst through the flimsy door, slamming it shut behind him. He fumbled for a piece of rotten lumber and jammed it into the doorframe as a makeshift lock that he finally turned on his small flashlight. The beam revealed a claustrophobic space, filled with rust-coated pipes, dust, and the skeletal remains of old machinery. The air was dry, dusty, and thankfully devoid of that metallic stench that he leaned against the cold stone wall, trying to control his shaking and his breathing. He had to think, what is it? Why did it use the basement, then attack from the roof? Why the segmented trail? Why the ritual? Altar? He focused his flashlight on the smudge of residue still on his boot. It was drying now, turning into a hard, brittle lacquer. He scraped off a piece with his knife and held it up. It looked like ancient, dark amber. Suddenly his light caught something else. Near the back wall of the pump house, behind a tangle of rusted valves, the stone wall looked different. It was cleaner, smoother, and carved with something that wasn't weathered moss or dirt. Ben knelt, wiping the grime away with his sleeve. The stone surface was covered in a repeating pattern of carvings. They were stylized serpentine shapes, looping around a central elongated figure that vaguely resembled a man standing on 2 legs, but whose head was a terrifyingly accurate representation of the creature's face, reptilian, intelligent, with those horrible, pale eyes. Underneath the carving, chiseled crudely into the stone, was a phrase in English, ancient but legible, worn down by time. "The serpent doth hide its shell." Ben stared at the words, his mind reeling. Shell? The creature's resilience. The bullet sticking to it. The impossibly thick skin that it sheds its armor. It leaves its shell, or skin, and the residue is a sign of it. The pump house, hidden deep in the woods, the closest structure to the mansion that wasn't actively guarded. The segmented residue trail leading away from the manor. A sudden, earth-shaking thud outside the small structure ripped Ben from his thoughts. The ground vibrated. He knew what it was. It had followed the noise of his flight, and it had found the small structure. Then a low, rasping sound started just outside the door, right where the rotten jam was struggling to hold the plank of wood. It sounded like thick fingernails scraping wet cement. The creature was trying to pry the door open. Ben raised his gun, pointing it uselessly at the flimsy door. He had 2 bullets left in his magazine. He couldn't fight it. He had to understand the carving. The serpent doth hide its shell. He glanced around the small room. Behind the pipework there was a deep, circular well, the old pump well, covered with a heavy, rusted metal grate. The grating wasn't the shell. The pump house was the shell. The structure itself. The creature was trying to enter its old, hidden lair. Not to eat him, but perhaps to retrieve something. Another tremendous crack in the makeshift lumber lock snapped. The door flew inward, torn from its hinges. The creature stood in the doorway, its enormous silhouette filling the entire frame. Its pale, reflecting eyes narrowed, fixing instantly on Ben. It raised one arm, ready to strike. Ben aimed not at the creature, but at the rusted grate over the well. He squeezed the trigger twice. Bang. Bang. The 2 9mm rounds hit the rusted metal grate. They didn't penetrate, but the force, combined with the extreme rust, was enough. The grate shifted, wobbled, and then clanged loudly as it fell into the deep, dark well below. The creature stopped. Its attack posture faltered. It slowly lowered its arm, its head tilting. It ignored Ben completely. Its eyes were not on him or the hole in the door, but on the exposed, dark opening of the well. Ben realized with chilling certainty that he had just stumbled into the very heart of the serpent's lair. The creature's attention was completely fixed on the open well. Ben realized this was his only window, a moment of distraction granted by whatever terrible significance that deep, dark hole held for the monster that he scrambled backward, away from the well and the open doorway, pressing his back against the cold stone wall, reloading his weapon with 2 fresh rounds from his belt clip. He kept his movements slow, measured, terrified of breaking the creature's singular focus. The monstrous figure took a slow, deliberate step into the pump house. The metallic stench intensified, confirming that the very air around it was poisonous. It moved with a strange reverence toward the well. Its actions were not those of a simple beast. There was intelligence, intent, and an almost mournful quality in the way it approached the gaping hole. It carefully extended its long serpentine neck over the edge of the well, peering into the blackness. Ben dared to look past the creature, out the gaping doorway. In the far distance, he could see the faint flashing of emergency lights and the silhouettes of police officers surrounding the mansion. Lieutenant Pierce and the remaining team must have escaped, or backup had finally arrived. They were still too far away to help. The creature finally straightened, letting out a low, almost sorrowful hiss. It gently lowered one of its huge, scaled hands into the well's opening. It was reaching for something. Ben seized the moment. He had to know what was in the well. But more importantly, he had to get out and warn Harrison about the creature's bullet resistance and strategic movement. With a desperate cry of "Hey!" Ben flung his tactical flashlight, still switched on, high into the air, aiming it past the creature and out the open door. The creature reacted instantly. Its head snapped up, following the arc of the light, the sudden movement revealing the full, terrifying flexibility of its neck and spine. It tracked the light until it hit the ground outside the pump house. This was the distraction Ben needed. He shoved the barrel of his empty handgun into his belt and sprinted toward the open doorway, veering sharply around the creature's massive body that he felt the wind rush past his ear as the creature realized the trick. Its huge arms swung in a blurring arc, missing Ben by mere inches. The claw raked through the air where his head had been a second before, leaving behind the powerful, acrid scent of its residue. Ben burst out of the pump house and didn't look back. He ran deeper into the maze of trees, running parallel to the direction of the emergency vehicles, hoping to break free of the woods and reach the main road that he finally stumbled out onto the cracked asphalt of Highway 12, collapsing onto his hands and knees. The rain had slowed to a drizzle. Across the road, maybe 200 yards down, was a chaotic gathering of police cars, fire trucks, and the flashing lights of an ambulance, the hastily established perimeter that he pushed himself up, ignoring the aches and cuts, and started sprinting towards the light that he was intercepted halfway by a pair of uniformed officers, who initially treated him as a suspicious vagrant until they recognized the blood-spattered uniform of Officer Carter. "Chief Harrison, I need to see the chief now," Ben shouted, shoving past the officers, his voice raw. Chief Harrison was standing near a mobile command unit, his face pale and etched with disbelief, talking to a shaken Lieutenant Pierce, whose uniform was ripped and covered in blood, not his own. It just snatched Miller, "Chief," right through the window, clean as a whistle. "Those weren't gunshots, sir, that was the damn glass shattering. And the thing was huge," Pierce was saying, his voice barely a tremor. Harrison saw Ben approaching and his expression shifted from disbelief to cold fury. "Carter, you abandoned your post. You're under arrest, officer." "No," Ben screamed, skidding to a halt in front of the chief. "Listen to me. I know what it is. It's not just an animal. And you can't shoot it." He grabbed the chief's wrist and thrust the small, dried piece of residue he had scraped from his boot into Harrison's hand. "It's covered in this. It's like armor. We hit it with 3 rounds, Chief, and they just stuck. We found a carving in an old pump house. It said, 'The serpent doth hide its shell.'" He was gasping for air but forced the words out. "This thing is using the house as a hunting ground, but its lair is that pump house. I found a well there. I went straight for it. It's connected to whatever ritual they were doing." Harrison stared at the strange, black, brittle shard in his palm, then at Ben's wild, desperate eyes. He looked over at Lieutenant Pierce, whose nod was confirmation enough that whatever happened was truly beyond the scope of their training. "Okay," Harrison said slowly, the disbelief finally yielding to stark fear. Pierce, secure the pump house. But no engagement. Contain it. Carter, tell me about this ritual. What did the woman have in her mouth? A piece of carved bone, Ben replied, his memory sharp and clear. A perfect white piece of bone. The creature snatched it from her mouth in the basement. A middle-aged man in an expensive wool coat and thick-rimmed glasses pushed through the crowd of officers. He was the owner of the house, Mr. Alastair Finch. He was livid, distraught, and clearly oblivious to the horror that had unfolded. Chief Harrison, I demand to know what is going on. That's my wife Sarah in there. The dispatch confirmed it, and my antiques. You let a simple burglar wreck my property and kill my wife. Harrison stepped between Finch and Ben. Mr. Finch, your wife is deceased. We are investigating a homicide of the most serious nature. We need you to cooperate. Did you notice anything missing from your house? Any strange deliveries? Anything at all that connects to ritualism or ancient objects? Finch scoffed, running a hand through his thinning hair. Ancient objects? I collect fine art. My wife Sarah was doing some eccentric interior decorating lately, yes. She was obsessed with that ridiculous occult section of the city library. But the only ancient thing in that house was locked away. It's my inheritance. A bronze casket that holds the bones of a priest from some fringe cult she found online. But I locked it up. I locked it deep inside my study. He pointed a trembling finger toward the massive estate. It's in a concealed safe behind the bookshelf, locked with a biometric code. No one could possibly get to it. Ben and Harrison exchanged a horrified look. Chief, Ben said, his voice flat with dawning dread. The dead woman had a carved bone in her mouth. The creature is after the bones. And the entrance to that study is on the first floor. They had trapped the creature outside its main lair, the pump house, and inside its hunting ground, the estate. But they had forgotten the lure. The bait that if the creature was moving toward the pump house, it was because the pump house held the key to its shell or its existence. But if it was in the house, it was because it was after the bones. Suddenly, the night erupted. A tremendous, echoing crash came from the direction of the mansion. It was the sound of a load-bearing wall collapsing inward. They looked towards the house. A fresh cloud of dust and debris billowed from the upper floor. The creature wasn't just in the house. It was systematically destroying it to find the safe. The hunt was on, and the police force had just become collateral damage in a monstrous treasure hunt. The crash from the mansion galvanized the perimeter. Uniformed officers, galvanized by the undeniable sound of structural destruction, began shouting into their radios. Chief Harrison pushed Mr. Finch aside and dragged Ben toward the mobile command unit. Carter, you and Pierce are the only ones who have faced this thing and lived, Harrison said, his voice clipped and serious. Forget the protocols. What does it want? And how do we stop it? Ben felt a terrible, cold clarity descend. It wants those bones, Chief. Mr. Finch said they were from a fringe cult priest and locked in a safe behind the study bookshelf. The creature is systematically tearing that house apart to get them. It's too strong to fight head-on. He pointed to the mobile unit's large topographical map of the estate. We need to stop its movement. Look at this map. The house is the immediate threat. The pump house is the lair. We need to focus on its weak point. Weak point? Harrison scoffed, running a hand over his tired face. It's bulletproof, Carter. What weak point? The residue, Ben stated, pointing to the spot on his boot where the dried film had hardened. It's its armor. It slows it down, it protects it. But the carving said, the serpent doth hide its shell. I think it needs the pump house, that well, to shed its old skin or replenish this armor. That's why it went there after killing Moreno. It was looking for its safe haven. Lieutenant Pierce, who had been listening intently, interjected. If it needs to re-armor, we stop it from getting back to that pump house. We can lay out a full perimeter there, Chief. Firemen have high-pressure hoses. Maybe we can knock it down, keep it off balance. No, Ben countered, shaking his head. The pump house is secondary. The bones are primary. If it gets those relics, it wins. We need to lure it out of the mansion, away from the bones, and away from any more officers. He looked at Finch, who was huddled, weeping nearby. Mr. Finch, is there anything else of value in that study safe? Something the creature might ignore? Finch sniffled, wiping his eyes. "A few investment documents. My late father's journal. It detailed the origins of that wretched casket. He was the one who bought it from the cultists years ago. Called them the Children of the Void." Ben felt a chilling confirmation. The cult is the key. "Chief, we have to create a diversion. We need to draw the creature out using what it wants or what it thinks it wants." Harrison looked doubtful. "We're not using police officers as bait, Carter." "No, we're using its prize as bait," Ben said, his eyes scanning the map. He pointed to the long, winding gravel driveway. "The creature is too fast for us and too armored. But it's focused. We need to break its focus. Plan Alpha, decoy." Harrison gave a curt nod. "Pierce, take 2 men. Go back to the house but do not engage. Find that study. Locate the safe. If you can, extract the bronze casket. If the safe is open, extract the casket. If the safe is locked, you wait for the distraction. Ben, you're with me. We're going to set up a diversion point down the main driveway. If this thing is after the relics, we make it think the relics are escaping." The situation was absurd, terrifying, and utterly necessary. They were fighting a supernatural predator with police tactics. Pierce and his 2 remaining officers, moving with grim, tight discipline, crept back towards the damaged mansion. The crashing sounds had stopped. The house was now eerily silent again, a monstrous stillness that was far worse than the noise. They entered through a broken window on the ground floor. The damage was shocking. Walls had been peeled back like wallpaper. Furniture was tossed and shredded. The creature had used brute force, not stealth, to search. They found the study, a small, dark room relatively untouched. The expensive bookshelf was pushed askew. Behind it, the heavy steel of the safe door was exposed. But the safe wasn't locked. It was hanging open on its hinges, the metal buckled and torn. It hadn't been opened. It had been ripped open. Pierce aimed his light into the safe. It was empty. The bronze casket containing the cult priest's bones was gone. "Chief, we have a problem," Pierce whispered into his radio, his voice strained. "The safe is breached. The casket is gone. It's still inside the house. I repeat, it has the prize." Down the driveway, Ben and Harrison were setting up the decoy. They had pulled the back bench seat out of a damaged patrol car and placed it on the asphalt, covering it with a blanket to simulate the size and shape of a human or a container. "It's a long shot, Carter," Harrison muttered, checking his shotgun, loaded with specialized slug rounds, for the 10th time. "If it has the bones, why would it come back out? It needs to finish its ritual, Chief." It took the bone from the victim's mouth. It took the casket from the safe. It's gathering the components. And I think it needs to get back to that pump house to complete its transformation or whatever this ancient ritual is about. Just then, Pierce's message came through, confirming their worst fear. "It has the prize. Get out of there, Ben." Harrison barked into the radio. Before Harrison could even lower the radio, a shape dropped from the upper window of the house, landing with a sickening thud on the grass. That it was the creature. It moved with renewed, terrifying speed, no longer searching but fleeing, and it was holding something. Tucked against its immense, serpentine chest was the dark, oxidized bronze casket, gleaming faintly in the periphery of the light. The creature's pale eyes immediately fixed on the patrol car parked near the road, the closest, fastest way to escape the area. It began to lope toward the road, a horrifying, multi-limbed dash through the undergrowth. "It's coming. Get ready," Harrison yelled. The creature reached the edge of the driveway, crossing the gravel toward the patrol car. As it passed the decoy, the covered bench seat, it didn't slow down. It barely glanced at the lump. It was too focused on escape and the precious cargo in its grasp. "It's ignoring the bait," Ben shouted. "Then we force the engagement." Harrison roared, leveling his shotgun. "Scatter, Ben." Harrison fired the slug rounds. Crack, crack. The slugs hit the creature squarely in the back. Unlike the 9mm rounds, the powerful slugs didn't stick. They peeled away small, brittle chunks of the dark, hard residue, revealing a sickeningly pale, almost translucent skin underneath. The creature roared, a high-pitched, vibrating sound of anger and pain. It dropped the bronze casket. That it spun around, its elongated, reptilian face contorted in a silent snarl, its pale eyes locked onto the source of the attack. For the first time, the serpent was wounded, its armor compromised. and now its full, terrible attention was on the two remaining officers. The serpent had lost its prize, and it wanted revenge. Ben and Harrison had seconds to move before the full, unbridled fury of the ancient predator was upon them. The creature's roar wasn't just loud, it was a physical force, a deep, resonating sound that vibrated through Ben's chest. The sight of the pale, vulnerable skin beneath the shattered residue confirmed Ben's theory. The armor was the key. And now the serpent was exposed and enraged. Harrison, however, was trained for this exact kind of high-stakes, close-quarters combat. Even facing a nightmare, he reacted, "Ben, the casket, grab the prize. I'll draw its focus." Harrison yelled, already sprinting sideways, reloading his shotgun with practiced speed. The creature didn't hesitate. Having been physically hurt for the first time, its instinct shifted from flight to overwhelming attack. It lunged at Harrison, closing the 15-foot distance in a horrifying blur. Its speed was amplified by its multi-jointed limbs, which worked in a terrifying, synchronized gait. Harrison didn't fire. He knew the remaining armor would absorb the blast. Instead, he pulled a fragmentation grenade from his belt, a last resort tool for cornered suspects, yanked the pin and rolled it towards the creature's enormous feet. The creature's intelligence was undeniable. It immediately recognized the threat. It didn't stop, but instead executed a sharp, impossible pivot, using its elongated claws to dig into the gravel and launch itself laterally, avoiding the blast radius. Boom. The explosion ripped a hole in the asphalt, showering the area with debris, but the creature was already in motion, focused on Ben. Ben ignored the ringing in his ears. His eyes were fixed on the target, the oxidized bronze casket, which had rolled to a stop near the front tires of the cruiser that he sprinted towards it, diving low just as the creature's immense, serpentine form rushed past him. The heat of its passage and the stench of the residue was overwhelming. Ben scrambled, grabbing the casket. It was heavy, oddly warm to the touch, and carved with the same swirling reptilian pattern as the ancient symbols in the pump house that he didn't have time to register its weight. He spun around, clutching the casket to his chest, just in time to see the creature cornering Harrison, who had emptied his shotgun in a desperate attempt to slow the beast. The remaining slugs only chipped away more of the dark armor, creating shallow, white wounds that didn't bleed, but merely glistened. The creature let out another shriek, raising one of its powerful forelimbs, its talons spread wide to tear Harrison apart. "Hey, look at me!" Ben screamed, lifting the casket high above his head. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. The creature froze, its attention tearing away from Harrison as if a physical leash had been pulled. Its pale, malevolent eyes locked onto the bronze relic. The desire radiating from it was palpable, a desperate, consuming hunger. It slowly lowered its attack limb, its entire body quivering with fixation. It took a slow, deliberate step toward Ben. "Drop it, Carter. Get out of here." Harrison yelled, pushing himself off the ground, bruised but alive. "No. It wants this more than it wants us," Ben yelled back. He was now the only thing standing between the creature and the culmination of its grotesque ritual. He looked over his shoulder. The perimeter was too far. He had to create distance and draw the monster away from the main road and the other officers who were now converging on the junction. Ben turned and ran directly into the deep, dark woods, clutching the heavy casket. The creature reacted with a burst of terrifying, unleashed speed. It moved like a striking snake, not a heavy predator. It was pursuing him with a deadly, focused rage. As Ben plunged into the forest, he could hear the ground pounding behind him, closer, faster. He didn't have the endurance or the speed to outrun this thing. He needed a plan. He noticed that the creature was careful. Despite its size and speed, it was avoiding large obstacles, weaving around trees, almost as if it were compensating for the loss of its armor, afraid of damaging its exposed, pale flesh. It doesn't just want the casket. It needs the bones inside to complete its task, and it needs to get back to the pump house to be safe, Ben thought, running a desperate calculation. He burst into another clearing, his lungs burning. Ahead, he saw the faint, dark outline of the abandoned pump house he had escaped from earlier. He had a crazy idea. He didn't just need to draw the creature out. He needed to trap it. He skidded to a stop right in front of the pump house door, or where the door had been. He threw the bronze casket inside with a heavy clang. The creature arrived an instant later, skidding to a halt just 10 feet behind him. Its chest was heaving with silent, serpentine breathing. It didn't strike Ben. Its entire focus was on the casket lying just inside the threshold of its ancient lair. It took one slow step toward the doorway. "It's waiting," Ben whispered, backing away, his heart sinking. "It's waiting for me to leave. It wants to go back to its lair and finish its ritual." He pulled his radio from his shoulder, his voice strained but steady. "Chief, it's at the pump house." "Repeat, the creature is at the pump house, 300 yards northwest of the manor. It's focused on the bronze casket I threw inside. Get the fire hoses. Now, aim for the creature's back. It's exposed." The creature, sensing the impending ambush, let out a piercing, warning hiss, its head slowly swiveling towards Ben. It was sacrificing its immediate prize for the immediate threat. Suddenly, two powerful jets of water, deployed by the fire department officers Harrison had hastily organized, slammed into the clearing. The water pressure was immense, tearing through the undergrowth. One jet hit the creature square in its massive, pale back, right where Harrison's slug had cracked the armor. The force of the water didn't wound it, but it knocked the creature sideways, throwing its coordination into chaos. The exposed skin seemed to ripple under the pressure. The second jet hit the creature's lower body, causing it to lose its footing. It collapsed onto the ground with a loud, sickening thwomp. Its elongated limbs splayed uselessly in the mud. For a moment, the serpent was neutralized. Subdued by water and pressure, but not defeated. Ben watched, his heart pounding a victory drum, but the creature suddenly began to move. Not running but crawling rapidly, pulling itself desperately toward the pump house. It didn't want to fight the water. It wanted the sanctuary of the well. It dragged itself through the doorway, its bulk scraping against the stone. Ben knew what was next. Once inside, it would seal itself away, and the whole terrifying cycle would begin again, only next time the creature would be armored and rejuvenated. Ben had to stop the ritual now. He had to destroy the bones. He saw a heavy, rusted metal pipe lying near the pump house entrance, dislodged by the grenade blast. He grabbed it, ignoring the pain in his hands. He plunged into the pump house, ignoring the blasts of water that were now sweeping the interior, desperately trying to keep the creature down. The creature was kneeling over the bronze casket, its exposed back to Ben. Its scaled hands were fumbling with the intricate locking mechanism. It was close. Ben raised the pipe above his head, aiming for the casket, not the creature. This was his only chance to end the serpent's hunt. Ben brought the rusted metal pipe down with all the strength of his terror and exhaustion. He didn't aim for the serpent, which was still momentarily stunned and struggling under the force of the high-pressure water jets. He aimed for the oxidized bronze casket. Crack. The heavy pipe slammed into the casket. The old, brittle bronze, weakened by age and perhaps by the creature's recent hurried breach of the safe, didn't hold. It fractured violently. A cloud of fine, gray dust and fragments of bone, the skeletal remains of the cult priest, exploded outward. The remnants of the ritualistic relics scattered across the damp, concrete floor of the pump house, mixing instantly with the torrent of water. The effect on the serpent was immediate and catastrophic. It didn't scream, nor did it attack. It emitted a high-pitched, vibrating wail, a sound of pure, agonizing loss and desolation. Its entire body went rigid, then began to convulse violently. The serpentine length thrashed against the floor and the walls of the pump house, knocking the high-pressure hoses offline with sickening thwacks of its powerful tail. Ben scrambled backward, shielding his eyes from the debris. The creature was writhing, not in a fight, but in some kind of existential agony. Chief Harrison and Lieutenant Pierce rushed to the doorway, their guns raised, staring in shocked disbelief. "What the hell is happening, Carter?" Harrison shouted over the roar of the creature's collapse. "I destroyed the bones. I broke the casket." Ben yelled back. It needed them for the ritual. It needed them for something. The creature's thrashing subsided into a low, desperate trembling. It curled inward, protecting its head with its massive limbs, its pale, exposed skin pulsating faintly. It was still alive, but clearly broken, its motive force shattered. Harrison, seeing the creature paralyzed by grief or shock, pointed a decisive finger. "Pierce, rubber bullets, non-lethal. Focus on the exposed skin. Pin it down." Pierce and his officers immediately opened fire with specialized non-lethal rounds. The heavy rubber projectiles impacted the creature's soft, pale flesh with loud thumps, eliciting new spasms of agony. The creature barely reacted to the pain, still consumed by its focus on the scattered, gray dust that was once the bones. Under the steady barrage of rubber rounds, the serpent was slowly driven back, not toward Ben, but toward the deep, black opening of the well, its intended sanctuary. As the creature backed up, Ben noticed something crucial. Where the water had soaked the creature's cracked armor, and where the rubber bullets had impacted the exposed skin, a thin, brownish-yellow liquid was beginning to seep out, mixing with the water on the floor. It wasn't blood. It looked like ancient, thick venom, or perhaps the chemical precursor to its armor. It smelled acrid and sickly sweet. The creature finally reached the edge of the well. With a final heartbreaking moan, a sound Ben would never forget, it plunged backward into the blackness, seeking refuge or perhaps an end in the deep water source of its lair. The sound of the splash was immense, echoing up from the dark hole, followed by complete silence. The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. The area was cordoned off as a massive crime scene. CSI units, detectives, and now, finally, men in plain clothes from federal agencies, the ones who always show up when things stop making sense, began swarming the pump house in the mansion. Ben, wrapped in a blanket, shivering from shock and cold, sat in the back of the ambulance giving his statement to a quiet, intense detective named Anna Reyes, who had driven up from the state capitol. Reyes stared at the photograph CSI was taking. The shattered safe, the ruined dining room, the bizarre altar inn, the basement, and the strange, segmented residue now drying and hardening on the concrete. "Officer Carter," Reyes said, her voice low and clinical, "you saved the lives of multiple officers, but you also witnessed the destruction of the key evidence, the cult bones, and you allowed the suspect to escape into an unknown well." "It wasn't a suspect, Detective," Ben said, looking her straight in the eye. "It was a monster, and I didn't allow it to escape. I neutralized the threat. The creature needed those bones to complete its ritual. Without them, it's broken, vulnerable, and hopefully dead down there. And what was the ritual for? I don't know. But the victim, Sarah Finch, had one of those bones in her throat. I think it was used to initiate the ritual, or maybe to feed the creature the initial energy it needed to emerge. It was collecting the rest of the priest's body to stabilize or transform itself." Reyes studied the carving Ben had photographed on his phone, the serpentine figure, the phrase, "The serpent doth hide its shell." "And you think the creature is in a dormant state down that well?" she asked. "It's wounded. The slug cracked its armor. The water damaged its skin. And I destroyed the one thing it risked everything to get. It's either regenerating or dying," Ben stated, the exhaustion making him feel unnaturally calm. Harrison walked up, his arm wrapped in a bandage where he'd been grazed by shrapnel from the grenade. He handed Ben a small, tarnished silver object. "We found this on the altar in the basement, Carter. It was hidden under the black cloth." Ben looked at the object. It was a heavy, silver pendant, tarnished black with age. It was carved with the same repeating serpentine motif, but in the center there was a tiny, recessed symbol, an open eye, dripping. Reyes leaned closer. "That's not local. That looks like a pre-Columbian religious symbol. Central or South America, perhaps. Used by a snake cult known as the Voids of the Tikal." "The Voids of the Tikal," Ben repeated, remembering Mr. Finch's frantic mention. "The children of the void." "Chief, this wasn't just a random cult," Ben said, gripping the pendant. "This was an ancient, specific ritual. And that creature, whatever it is connected to the very origins of that cult. Havenwood isn't just dealing with a monster, we're dealing with a history." "And what now?" Harrison asked, looking at the dark, still woods. Reyes looked at Ben, her expression sharp and calculating. "Now, Officer Carter, we drain that well, and we find out what's at the bottom. But before we do that, we need to understand how this serpent was called here in the first place." She tapped the silver pendant. "And I think the answers lie not in the woods but in the records of the people who knew about this thing. the Finches and that cult. Ben knew his involvement was far from over. This was the beginning of a much deeper, much darker investigation. The next morning, the Havenwood Police Department felt like a morgue and a circus combined. The smell of disinfectant mixed with stale coffee and the palpable tension of disbelief and dread. The story Ben Carter gave had been cross-referenced with Lieutenant Pierce's equally frantic account, the structural damage at the Finch estate, and the bizarre, unidentifiable residue found coating the pumphouse well. The higher-ups couldn't dismiss it, but they couldn't openly confirm it either. Detective Reyes took charge, forming a specialized, highly classified task force. It consisted of herself, Chief Harrison, Ben, and a young, unnervingly enthusiastic forensic pathologist named Dr. Anya Sharma, who specialized in zoology and unusual biological materials. Their first stop was the morgue. Doctor Sharma stood over the remains of Officer Lisa Moreno and Sarah Finch, her face alight with scientific curiosity rather than horror. The official report will list Officer Moreno's cause of death as blunt force trauma and strangulation, consistent with an attack by a large, powerful animal, Dr. Sharma said, adjusting her gloves. But unofficially, the trauma pattern is inconsistent with any known large predator. The crushing force was focused, almost surgical. And the residue found on her uniform is the most fascinating thing I've ever seen. She held up a small vial containing a droplet of the dark, thick substance Ben had encountered. It's a complex biopolymer. Highly concentrated proteins, trace minerals, and something unique, a rapidly hardening secretion. It acts as both armor and a natural adhesive. It's what allowed it to shatter the deadbolt and resist the 9mm rounds. She then pointed to Sarah Finch's body. And here is the anomaly. Cause of death is cardiac arrest, likely induced by extreme fear. But the trauma to her mouth and throat confirms Officer Carter's report. She showed them an X-ray of Finch's throat. The bone fragment was carved meticulously. But what's interesting is the surrounding tissue. There are microscopic traces of the creature's venom, the brownish-yellow fluid you described, Officer Carter, in her bloodstream. It was a catalyst. I believe the carved bone was a focal point, a key that the creature needed to activate its emergence or sustain its initial period of activity. By placing it in the victim's mouth, the ritual was essentially kick-started through the sacrifice. So the creature was using Mrs. Finch to power up? Ben asked, his voice tight. In a sense, yes. The bone was the fuse. The casket of bones was the battery, Dr. Sharma confirmed, her eyes shining behind her safety glasses. When you destroyed the main battery, you effectively cut its power source. It lost its structural integrity and was forced back into dormancy or retreat. Their second stop was Mr. Alastair Finch's statement. Finch was now housed at a local hotel, under heavy surveillance, less as a suspect and more as the unwilling custodian of a deadly secret. Reyes placed the silver pendant on the table. Mr. Finch, tell us about your father's journal and the Children of the Void. Everything. Finch, terrified and ruined, finally broke. My father, Edgar Finch, was an archaeologist obsessed with fringe religions. In the 1950s, he tracked a small group of fanatics called the Voids of the Tikal to a remote corner of Central America. They worshipped a serpentine deity they called Suthek, the sleeper in the earth. He trembled, pointing at the pendant. That symbol, the eye dripping, it represents Suthek awakening and crying out for sustenance. They believed Suthek would grant them immortality and wealth if they performed a specific sacrifice, feeding it the bones of a true believer who had prepared his own death. The cult priest whose bones were in the casket? Harrison pressed. Yes. A fanatic named Father Kynes. He willingly prepared his skeleton over decades, believing his bones held a purified life force that would bind Suthek to their command. My father stole the bronze casket containing Kynes' bones before the final ritual could be completed. He moved the bones to Havenwood and hid them, knowing the cult would search for them. Ben finally understood the full, chilling scope of the incident. The creature, Suthek, was buried deep beneath Havenwood. But it was only a sleeper. Mrs. Finch, your wife, must have found your father's journal and tried to finish the ritual. Sarah was desperate for power, for youth, Finch whispered, shame mixing with terror. She was talking to people online, the remnants of the voids. They told her she needed the bone key to wake the serpent, and then the full skeleton to control it. She must have taken the key bone from the casket, placed it in her throat, and waited for Suthek to emerge. And the creature wasn't bound to her command, Reyes concluded, her jaw tight. It simply consumed the first bit of sustenance and went after the rest of the battery, the casket. The final stop was the pump house well. Engineers and fire department teams had been working all morning to set up heavy-duty pumping equipment. As the large pumps began to roar, sucking water out of the deep, black well, Ben, Harrison, and Reyes watched the water level drop slowly. 2 hours passed. The water receded, revealing the rough, algae-coated sides of the well. The air around the opening grew colder, and the stench of the residue intensified. Finally, a heavy, pale shape was revealed at the bottom, resting on the silt and stone. It was the serpent. It was alive, but completely inert. It was curled in a tight, protective ball, its massive, armored limbs wrapped around its pale, exposed core. Its skin was mottled and oozing the brownish-yellow venom/armor precursor. It's breathing slow and shallow, a deep, protective hibernation. It's a shutdown, Dr. Sharma confirmed over the radio. Like a wounded reptile in brimation. It's trying to regenerate its armor, but without the bones, it lacks the energy. It's helpless but not dead. Harrison looked at the inert monster, then at Ben. We can't leave it there, Carter. It's too dangerous. What's the plan? Fire? Explosives? Reyes shook her head, her hand touching the silver pendant. No. Suthek has to be returned to dormancy permanently. The voids knew how to wake it, and they probably know how to put it back to sleep. And if they know the ritual, they know its one true vulnerability. She looked at Ben. Officer Carter, you know more about this creature's immediate patterns than anyone. We're going to need you to go down there. The sight of the monstrous, pale shape at the bottom of the well, however inert, was enough to make Ben's knees weak. But he knew she was right. If the bones were the battery and the pendant is the symbol of its awakening, Ben said, looking at the silver eye in Rhea's hand. What puts the serpent back to sleep? Its shell, Rhea stated. The one thing it uses for protection. We're going to use Dr. Sharma's chemical analysis of the armor residue and the high-pressure hoses to literally drown it in its own weakness. We just need to get close enough to administer the catalyst. The final phase of the operation was code-named Bruma, a nod to Dr. Sharma's term for the creature's dormant state. The plan was audacious, dangerous, and hinged entirely on Ben Carter. The core team, Ben, Harrison, Reyes, and Dr. Sharma, gathered near the pump house well. The serpent, Suthek, remained a massive, curled mass at the bottom, its slow, shallow breathing barely visible in the silt. Dr. Sharma held a large, sealed metal canister filled with a dark, oily liquid. The serpent's armor is a complex protein polymer that requires highly concentrated energy, the essence from the bones, to catalyze and harden, she explained, her voice quick and technical. Without the energy, the precursor venom it excretes remains liquid and sticky. This canister holds a hyper-concentrated chemical solvent. If we can apply this directly to the exposed skin of the serpent and then blast it with water, it won't be able to form a new shell. The solvent will accelerate the breakdown of its existing shell structure, dissolving its ability to protect itself. Essentially, we turn its armor against it. And the silver pendant? Ben asked, looking at the tarnished artifact Reyes was securing to a line of Kevlar rope. The voids believed this symbol represented Suthek's will, Reyes said. It's the focus point. We don't know if it's true, but we are going to use it as a distraction and a lure. When you get down there, Officer Carter, you will place this pendant directly on the creature's exposed core. It might trigger a reaction, giving us the window to administer the solvent. Ben was dressed in a fire-retardant suit, heavily reinforced, but it felt flimsy. He was attached to a heavy-duty winch system. Harrison clasped his shoulder, his gaze steady. You're the only one, Ben. The only one who knows its rhythm. You do this and Havenwood is safe. The descent into the well was slow, cold, and terrifyingly dark. Ben's helmet lamp cut through the damp air, illuminating the mossy stone walls. The stench of the serpent's residue was overwhelming, a concentrated musk that made his eyes water as he neared the bottom. The serpent began to stir. It wasn't a sudden violent awakening, but a slow, heavy unfolding. The head, massive and serpentine, rose slightly from the coiled mass. Its pale, lidless eyes, glowing faintly in the dark, fixed immediately on Ben. Made no sound, but the change in atmosphere was palpable. The air grew thick, cold, and charged with ancient malice. "It sees you, Carter. Now." Reyes's voice crackled urgently in his earpiece. Ben's heart hammered a frantic rhythm. He unhooked the small metallic canister of solvent from his belt and secured it to a thin line. He looked at the silver pendant in his hand, a tiny, fragile piece of metal that felt absurdly inadequate against this behemoth. That he landed on the muddy floor, his boots sinking slightly into the silt. The serpent's head was now fully raised, its mouth, filled with those horrifying rows of needled teeth, slowly opening in a silent hiss of pure, concentrated hatred. Ben had mere seconds. He rushed the inert, wounded side of the creature, aiming for the center of its coiled body, the exposed, vulnerable core. That he slapped the cold, tarnished silver pendant directly onto the pulsating, pale skin. The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. The serpent emitted a sonic shockwave, a high, piercing wail that overloaded Ben's headset and sent a jolt of pain through his skull. The creature's body arched, every muscle contracting. It wasn't attacking Ben, it was reacting to the pendant itself, as if the object contained a powerful, agonizing memory or command. "It's working. Fire the solvent." Ben screamed into his mic, clutching his head. On the surface, Harrison, controlling the delivery winch for the solvent canister, immediately released the line. The canister dropped quickly, hitting the muddy floor near the convulsing serpent with a dull thud. A small pressurized valve was activated upon impact, spraying the dark, oily solvent onto the creature's exposed skin. At the same time, the fire hoses rigged with specialized nozzles were activated. Two powerful high-pressure streams of water slammed down into the well. The combination was devastating. The moment the solvent mixed with the water and hit the creature's skin, the serpent began to smoke. Not the smoke of fire, but a thick, acrid vapor that smelled of burning oil and chemicals. The pale skin turned black, then bubbled and melted. The serpent's remaining armor, the sticky residue, dissolved instantly into a disgusting, thick froth. The creature's protective coil disintegrated. It thrashed one last time, a desperate final surge of energy that sent water and silt flying. One of its powerful, three-to-lone limbs whipped out, catching Ben's helmet and sending him spinning. Ben hit the cold, hard wall of the well, the impact staggering him. His headlamp swung wildly, revealing the serpent, now entirely exposed. Its true skin, dark, thin and glistening, was rapidly disintegrating under the chemical assault. He looked up just in time to see the creature's jaws opening wide in a final, silent snarl of fury, aimed not at the water, but at Ben. The serpent's eyes, those terrible, intelligent pale pinpoints, fixed on him one last time, filled with a promise of eternal vengeance. Then, with a sound like a wet sack dropping, the creature collapsed, melting into the dark, chemically charged water and silt at the bottom of the well. Ben was hauled out minutes later, exhausted, bruised, and covered in toxic residue, but alive. He stood on solid ground, looking down into the well, which was now silent, the water swirling with black, chemical sludge. Harrison and Reyes stood over the well's edge, their faces etched with relief and horror. Is it dead?" Harrison whispered. Doctor Sharma, scanning the well with a Geiger counter, a precaution they hadn't told Ben about, shook her head slowly. "No detectable life signs. But I don't think it's dead, Chief. I think we just stripped it of its ability to interact with our world. We forced the serpent back into its most fundamental, dormant state." Reyes looked down into the swirling blackness. The ritual was broken. The power source was destroyed. The armor is gone. We put the sleeper back to sleep, just where it was found. She then turned to Ben, handing him a clean blanket. "Officer Carter, you risked everything. You stopped a horror that would have destroyed this town." Ben didn't answer. He was staring at the silver pendant, which had been retrieved from the bottom of the well. The carving of the eye was no longer dripping. It was closed, sealed. "The voids won't stop," Ben said, his voice hoarse. They know the ritual. They know the location. Someone else will try to wake Suthek again. Reyes nodded, the weight of the investigation settling onto her shoulders. That's why this is no longer a police matter, officer. It's classified. The official report will state that the deaths were caused by a methane gas explosion and a cave-in, and the suspect died at the scene. Suthek goes back into the file of unexplained phenomena. But we, you, me and Harrison, we know the truth, and we will be watching. The serpent was gone, but the lair remained, a cold, dark monument to the ancient horror sleeping beneath Havenwood. Ben knew he would never look at a dark shadow or a quiet night the same way again. His life as a small-town cop was over. His new life, as one of the few who knew the truth of the serpent, was just beginning. The following 3 weeks were the quietest, most agonizing of Ben Carter's life. He was officially placed on paid administrative leave. The town of Havenwood accepted the media-fed story of the methane gas tragedy at the Finch estate with a strange collective sigh of relief, eager to forget the inexplicable violence that had shattered their peace. Ben, however, couldn't forget. He couldn't sleep without seeing the pale, serpentine eyes or hearing the bone-jarring roar that he spent his days in the departmental archives, a privilege granted by Chief Harrison, who now treated Ben with a mixture of respect and terrified deference. Ben was looking not for police reports but for anything. An old newspaper clipping, a surveyor's map, a municipal record, that linked the Willow Creek area to the voids of the Tikal, or to the creature, Suthek. Detective Reyes, true to her word, had formed a tiny, secretive interagency unit focused on preventing the next awakening. She called him daily, coordinating the monitoring of obscure occult forums and dark web markets. "We found something, Carter," Reyes said over the phone one rainy afternoon. "The remnants of the voids of the Tikal are active. They're calling the destruction of the bones a trial of faith, not a failure. They believe the serpent will return to power when the next lunar cycle aligns with the deepest point of the season. They're planning another trip to Havenwood. Do they know the well's location?" Ben asked, the cold dread instantly returning. "They know the general area of the pump house, but not the exact well," Reyes replied. "And they are bringing a replacement. They're calling it the Vessel of Contempt." Ben gripped the phone. "Another sacrifice? What is it?" "We don't know. But they are desperate. They tried to wake Suthek with the priest's bones and failed. This time their goal is likely simpler. Not to control it, but just to give it enough energy to fully regenerate its armor and escape the well. If that happens, it's loose again, and this time it will be prepared." Chief Harrison had ordered the pump house to be secured, not with standard police tape, but with heavy-duty steel plating welded over the well opening, a concrete floor poured over that, and the entire structure disguised as a utility shed. It was a prison disguised as a piece of infrastructure. Ben drove out there late that night, a heavy sense of responsibility weighing on him. He brought his father's old hunting rifle, a powerful piece of equipment far beyond his police service weapon. He couldn't shake the feeling that relying on government agencies was a fool's errand. This was his nightmare, and he had to be ready to face it alone. He sat in his personal truck, watching the disguised shed. The wind howled through the pines, sounding like 1,000 whispered curses. Around 2 a.m., the first sign of intrusion appeared. Not flashing lights or sirens, but a single dark sedan pulling off the main road, its lights instantly killed. Ben watched through the trees as 3 figures emerged. They wore heavy, dark robes despite the mild weather. They carried equipment, shovels, bags, and something long wrapped in burlap, which they handled with extreme reverence. The Vessel of Contempt. The 3 figures moved with the grim, practiced silence of fanatics. They didn't head for the old mansion, but unerringly toward the concealed pump house. They knew where the power was concentrated. Ben radioed Reyes, his voice low and tight. "Reyes, they're here. 3 of them. Dark robes, carrying some kind of package. I'm moving in. Hold, Carter. Backup is 10 minutes out. Do not engage," Reyes ordered. Ben ignored her. 10 minutes was too long. If they got to the well and administered the vessel, the serpent would awaken. He grabbed the hunting rifle, checked the chamber, and slipped out of his truck, moving through the woods toward the shed, The cultist had already reached the pump house. They were working quickly, setting up a portable blowtorch, melting through the thin layer of concrete that disguised the steel plating over the well. Ben crept within 40 feet, taking cover behind a thick oak tree. He raised the rifle, aiming for the blowtorch tank. The only thing he could safely disable from this distance. One of the cultists, a tall, emaciated figure who seemed to be the leader, unwrapped the burlap package. Ben gasped. It wasn't a casket or bones. It was a young woman. She was alive but heavily drugged, bound tightly, and dressed in a sheer white linen garment. Her face was pale and serene, utterly unaware of the horror about to unfold. The leader spoke in a low, reverent voice, directed at the sealed ground. Suthek, sleeper of the earth, we bring you the vessel of contempt, a soul unsullied by the ways of man. Consume her light, restore your form. Awaken, Lord of the Void. The other two cultists dragged the woman towards the spot where the blowtorch was starting to cut through the steel plating. Ben couldn't wait. He took a deep breath, steadied the rifle, and fired. Crack. The shot was true. The bullet impacted the small oxygen tank attached to the blowtorch. The resulting explosion was small but loud, sending shrapnel and sparks flying. The cultists cried out in surprise, momentarily scattering. The sound, however, was deafening in the quiet night. Ben didn't wait. He fired a second time, aiming for the leader's shoulder. The shot hit its mark. The cultist screamed and fell, clutching his wound. The remaining two cultists, driven by fanaticism, ignored the wounded leader. They dragged the unconscious woman over the scarred, exposed steel plate, ready to perform their grisly sacrifice right there, over the sealed tomb. Ben dropped the rifle, grabbed his police-issue 9mm, and sprinted from the cover of the woods, yelling, "Police! Drop your weapons." The two cultists turned, their faces contorted with rage and fanatic devotion. They weren't armed with guns but with ceremonial, rusted knives. They lunged at him, ready to sacrifice the officer who dared to interrupt their rite. The fight was brutal and short. Ben, driven by desperation, fought with savage efficiency, disarming the first cultist with a quick block and a powerful kick. The second one lunged, attempting to stab him in the chest. Ben dodged, fired his 9mm once into the cultist's leg, a non-lethal shot, and slammed the butt of his weapon into the man's temple. Both were down. Ben rushed to the unconscious woman, quickly checking her bindings and finding them secured. He turned back to the well. The commotion, the shouting, the gunfire, and the explosion had served a purpose beyond stopping the cultists. They had reached the sleeper. From beneath the thick steel plate, a low, resonant thrumming began. It was slow at first, then rapidly accelerated, sounding like a colossal heart beating deep within the earth. The steel plate, thick and industrial grade, began to vibrate violently. A thin, sickly yellow liquid, the serpent's venomous secretion, started to weep from the hairline cracks in the surrounding concrete. Suthek was awake, and it was furious. The throbbing increased. Ben looked at the steel plate, which was starting to buckle under an unseen immense pressure from below. He knew he had only moments before the serpent burst free. The cultists were unconscious, the sacrifice was safe, but the monster was coming back. Ben grabbed the woman, dragging her away from the vibrating epicenter, preparing for the final, desperate confrontation. The steel plate over the well began to scream. It was the hideous sound of industrial metal yielding to impossible biological force, tearing and screeching as the enormous pressure from below sought release. The thick, yellowish venom was now oozing freely from the fissures. The air thick with the acrid, musky stench. Ben dragged the unconscious woman further into the clearing, placing her behind the thick stone foundation of the ruined pump house. He looked back at the well. The center of the steel plate bulged violently, and then with a sound like a cannon shot, it tore open. A section of the plate, a foot-thick, jagged piece of steel, was launched high into the air. Through the rupture, the massive, scaled head of Suthek erupted. The serpent was weaker than before, its full armor gone, its skin still a translucent, sickly pale gray, slick with the corrosive venom. But it was alive, and its eyes, those burning, malevolent pinpoints, were fixed with pure, unadulterated rage on Ben. It shrieked, a sound that shredded the remaining piece of the forest. The creature ripped the remaining steel plating off the well opening and dragged its immense, serpentine body out, shedding the black, chemical sludge and clinging to the venomous goo that was its only remaining defense. "Reyes, I'm compromised. It's out. I repeat, the serpent is active and exposed." Ben yelled into his radio. "Carter, get out of there. Backup is rounding the bend." Reyes shouted back, her voice tight with panic. Ben stood his ground. He knew the serpent would ignore the distant police lights and focus only on the immediate threat, the officer who had destroyed its ritual and its source of power. The creature lunged, using its massive, elongated limbs to cover the distance in 2 horrifying strides. Ben didn't run. He raised his 9mm and emptied the clip directly into the creature's exposed head. The bullets, standard police rounds, were useless against the thick hide, but the sudden impact of the barrage momentarily stunned the beast that it wasn't enough. The serpent backhanded Ben with a casual swipe of its taloned hand. The blow hit Ben's side like a baseball bat, sending him sprawling across the gravel driveway. The air rushed out of his lungs in a painful gasp. Ben lay dazed, watching the creature tower over him, its huge reptilian head tilting, preparing for the finishing blow. He saw the yellowish venom dripping from its teeth. Suddenly, a voice cut through the carnage. It was the cult leader who was recovering from his rifle wound, clutching his bleeding shoulder. He crawled towards the serpent, his face ecstatic. "Sadhak, Lord of the Sleeper, do not consume this meager vessel. Turn your power upon the usurpers. They tried to bind you. Now go forth and cleanse this world." The cultist raised his bloodied hand in a final, defiant gesture. The serpent paused, its head twitching. It looked from Ben, the immediate, tangible threat, to the delirious cultist, the source of the recent chaos and the failed ritual. The creature's pale eyes narrowed, a moment of chilling clarity in its bestial fury. The creature turned, not toward the distant sounds of the police, but toward the cultist with terrifying, swift precision. Sadhak seized the cult leader in one enormous, scaled hand. The cultist, realizing his divine lord had chosen him as the usurper, screamed in a high, terrified pitch. The serpent didn't rip him apart. Instead, it pinned the man to the ground and plunged its taloned fingers deep into the cultist's chest. The sound of cracking ribs was sickeningly audible. The serpent was not consuming him. It was feeding out a dark, viscous vapor. Ben instinctively knew it was the stolen life force or ritual energy, began to rise from the cultist's body and flow toward the serpent's exposed pale skin. As the energy was absorbed, the creature's skin changed. It darkened quickly, thickening and hardening. The sticky, corrosive venom on its body suddenly began to catalyze, turning into a solid, impenetrable, obsidian black shell. Its armor was rapidly regenerating. The creature had found a quicker, more direct way to power up than the bones. It was consuming the very life force of its fanatic followers. Ben watched, horrified, as the serpent completed its grotesque meal. Within seconds the cultist was dead, a shriveled husk. And the serpent was fully armored, its scales now a dense, shimmering black. It was stronger, faster, and untouchable. It turned its terrifying, armored gaze back to Ben, who was struggling to stand. The police sirens were now close, lights flashing through the trees. The serpent let out one last, triumphant, deafening roar, a sound that shook the windows of the approaching police cars, and then, with a devastating surge of speed, it shot toward the deep cover of the Havenwood woods, not bothering to face the human threat. It was armored, powered, and free. Minutes later, Chief Harrison and Detective Reyes arrived, finding a stunned, injured Ben Carter, 2 wounded cultists, 1 dead cultist, and a ruined well. Harrison stared at the massive, dark trail of the serpent's segmented residue leading into the seemingly infinite woods. "Where did it go, Carter?" Ben leaned on the ruined truck, clutching his throbbing side. He looked at the vast, silent darkness of the Havenwood forest. "It's loose, Chief. It's fully armored and it knows the land. It's not a low